So hello everyone. So we'll be starting in exactly 1 minute. But before we start, just a few reminders and a few instructions. This webinar will be conducted in both English and French. So if you are a French speaker, you please click on the language button at the bottom of your screen and choose French. And also if you're in English, you choose the English channel at the bottom of your screen. We would like to know more about our attendees, so please also try to introduce yourself on the chat. So on the chat panel, so you can click on the chat and then introduce yourself and your organization and where you are from. The questions will be gathered by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, where you can type your questions during the presentation of the speakers. These questions will be consolidated later on and will be addressed by the speakers during the open forum. We will also be live streamed on Facebook on the Indigenous Peoples Rights International page. So we will also be getting questions from Facebook. And we would like also to inform the speakers to please mute all your microphones while you are not speaking. And also when you are speaking, to speak directly to your cameras. So in a few seconds, we will formally start with Joanne, the moderator, who will be starting as a moderator.
Okay, good day to everyone, and welcome to all on this webinar on criminalization of and impunity against Indigenous peoples, experience of Asia and Africa. I am Joanne Carling. I am an Indigenous activist from the Philippines and acting as the co-director of the Indigenous Peoples Rights International. So again, welcome to this webinar. This is already the third that IPRI is holding around the celebration of the International Day for Indigenous Peoples. The first that we had was the launching of the Indigenous Peoples International, Indigenous Peoples Rights International, and the second was yesterday on the Anti-Terrorist Act and its implications to Indigenous peoples here in the Philippines. And finally, we're having this two series on criminalization of and impunity against Indigenous peoples. The first that we're having now is on the experience of Asia and Latin America and Africa. And tomorrow we will also have the experience of Latin America. So why are we holding this this webinar on these issues? First, the criminalization of Indigenous peoples around the globe has worsened in the coming years. And when we say criminalization of Indigenous peoples, we're talking of the discriminatory laws and violations of the rights of Indigenous peoples, both the fundamental rights and freedoms, as well as the collective rights of Indigenous peoples. These include, for example, laws and practices that restricts or prohibit the practice of traditional occupations, where indigenous peoples are being arrested and detained simply by using their forest resources or the resources from the river, for example, or cases of killings and arrest and detention when indigenous peoples take action to defend their land rights against land grabbing or even against conservation measures. And that is clearly against the collective rights of indigenous peoples to their lands, territories, and resources. So when we're talking of criminalization of an impunity against indigenous peoples, we're talking about this critical condition of indigenous peoples where we are not able to realize our individual rights and our collective rights as indigenous peoples. Now, for this session, we are particularly focusing on criminalization of indigenous peoples under COVID-19, under the pandemic.
De la COVID-19, dans le cadre de cette...
We want to highlight this is because there's more cases. It has worsened under the pandemic due to strict measures imposed by states, particularly lockdowns, where there are restrictions to movements, there are restrictions to economic activities, which has disproportionately affected indigenous peoples around the globe. And this criminalization under COVID it also includes the intensified land grabbing in the name of recovery from economic recovery from the COVID. So we have, for this session, we have three distinguished speakers from 3 countries. We have from Africa, we have from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and then for Asia, we have India and the Philippines. And these countries are seriously facing this kind of criminalization and impunity against indigenous peoples. And that is also the reason why IPRI, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, is focusing on these countries in addition to 3 other countries in Latin America, namely Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. So we have 6 focus countries where we believe that they are facing urgent concerns and widespread criminalization of and impunity against indigenous peoples. So I want to introduce our speakers first, and then we will go to a
intervenant. Puis ensuite, nous
introduce them all. I will then ask the specific questions to our speakers, and then we will open the webinar for questions, which will of course be put in the Q&A section of this. So I would encourage our participants to put your questions so we can ask them after the 3 speakers have spoken. You can address your question to any of the speaker or a general question where any of them can respond to. So first, let me introduce our speaker from India. He's actually he's an indigenous youth and social worker. He's from the Bari indigenous community of Palghar in Maharashtra, which is the western part of India. He is a medical practitioner by profession, but he dedicated his life to community welfare as a social worker and an Adivasi social entrepreneur and as an environment activist. He is the secretary of the Adivasi Ekta Parishad, a community-based mass movement organization that fights for tribal rights and identity for 25 years. He led the fight against the multi-billion Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor Project, the Freight Corridor Project, and other projects. He also sits as the national coordinator of the Adivasi Samya Manch Bharat, or National Tribal Front India, and the secretary of the Forest Rights Committee of the Gram Panchayat, or Village Council. So he is our speaker from India, is Dr. Sunil Balkrishna Parad. He will be our first speaker. Then the one speaking from the Democratic Republic of Congo is the Executive Director of the National Alliance for the Support and Promotion of Areas and Territories conserved by Indigenous peoples and local communities in the Democratic Republic of Congo. He led and coordinated several local and provincial organizations for the defense of human rights and Indigenous peoples' rights. He is currently coordinating the network of Indigenous and local populations for the sustainable management of forest ecosystems, or called REPALIAC, in 8 Central African countries. So we are very, very privileged to have Joseph Itungwa with us, who is from the Walikale Indigenous peoples from the North Kivu province of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Our third speaker is from the Philippines. She is Rachel, a member of the Cordillera Human Rights Alliance, or CHRA, which is part of the Indigenous Peoples Human Rights Defenders Network. She is both a health worker and a human rights and indigenous rights defender based in the Cordillera region. In 2018, Rachel was arrested and jailed after being falsely accused of murder and frustrated murder charges. However, she was freed and acquitted of trump-up charges in September 2019 in Ilocos Sur. So we are also very privileged to have with us one of the victims of criminalization in the Philippines, who was
aux Philippines, qui est présente avec nous. Elle a souffert injustement.
We would also hear from her experience, as well as the situation of criminalization of Indigenous peoples under COVID in the Philippines. So with that brief introduction of our speakers, I would like to ask first from Sunil, our young social activist from India. So Sunil, can you please provide a brief description on the condition of Indigenous peoples in India under COVID-19, and what are the cases relating to criminalization of Indigenous peoples at this time of pandemic? Sunil, you can take the floor.
Okay.
Put on your mic, yeah.
All over in India, there is more than 10 million people, 100 million indigenous people in India. All are staying in the rural area, is near to the forest. And the pandemic situation of this COVID is very less cases detected in tribal area. But whatever is connected with the other cities area, then this spread over nowadays is spread in the tribal area or indigenous area of this COVID-19. The total, as you know, the total case of the all over the India is it's third rank India about the COVID all over the world after the US and Brazil. And the conditions in the villages regarding this COVID is very worse in cities other than in indigenous area. So it is quite safe. But what is the transfer from the such part from this migration due to the in villages, the cases are increased in village area. So that the conditions of the in the village area regarding the COVID, and totally dependency of the tribal economy is depend now on the uh, urban population. That's why they reconnected with this the urban population. That's why the daily life are disturbed from this, and people are locked down in this area. So uh, these conditions of the because of the unemployment and the this all things, and some cases are detected about this criminalization in this tribal area. Somehow some cases is a very tricky in this disturbed whole country, which is the case happen in my area in Palghar. It is a uh, mob lynching case. It happened in my area on 16th April 2020. The condition is that the national lockdown was imposed on 24th March 2020, and on 16th April 2020, around 10 p.m., the Adivasi villages of Gadching
Vers 22 heures,
Maharashtra,
à Palmarashta,
with three persons on suspicious to child kidnappers or the kidney rackets, or on the pretext of the spreading COVID-19 virus in their villages, as the kinds of rumors had been spreading in social media by their villages. At the time of reach the site, mob had gathered. They outcumbered mob attack on three travelers in the persons of the police. The entire incident was captured on video and was widely shared in social media. Three persons died in this incident, were identified as Kalprik Giri, Sushil Giri, and Nilesh Talkare, the driver of vehicle. There is a police station letter that two passengers were sadhus, monks, who were traveling from the Mumbai in Maharashtra. So in that they had been denied permission to proceed due to the lockdown, but continued to proceed night through back road toward the tribal area. That's is incident after the most worst communal hatred propaganda about the indigenous people. And all these some organizations in India, they are spread news regarding to tribal people. Yeah, it's very worse conditions about the tribal people. They even in social media, the 2 months after the incidents, there were threats coming from the non-Adivasi community or non-indigenous people to burn down the tribal villages, humans to rape, etc. Where are the call to tribals as a demons, uncivilized, Naxalites? That type of the news are spread in the this news, and they in news and the TV channels. Even the rumors of fear and psychosis in the indigenous people. The outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic and sudden announcement of the lockdown by the government and supposed to be media hype situation, rumors, threat, panic become more deadly than the pandemic itself. That indigenous community living away from the cities were preparing themselves to cope up this situation and protect their village and community the best possible way. Many have buried, and after this situation is a very much human rights violation about the indigenous people. Some of the civil society and indigenous human rights activists is the preliminary investigation report strongly condemned the lynching and expressed concern over the severe state repression in Adivasi women, minor, and aged person who were not connected with this incident. As a result, there was deployment as police force in this area, in this Palghar. On the pretext of the hunting prepared the lynching, more than 150 villagers are arrested, along almost all residents of this indigenous peoples village were interrogated by the police, and offense under the IPC sections have been the registered against the 5 accused, and more than section 180 and also be involved due to the coronavirus enforced lockdown restriction movement assembly of the people. The mother of the 9 juveniles who protest were arrested, several beaten up by the police. Many abandoned their homes and their livestock. They took the shelter in nearby forest without food. Unable to cope with the arrest, and grandson of 3 sons and forest watchman, this committed suicide due to the this violation and with the tribals. Feeling police repression, three pregnant women are the name as Raju More Sakuntala and the Shanti deliver their babies in the forest due to the fear of the police and the this government in government actions. An old person are reported dead in this forest due to this incident during the lockdown, and same cases are happened due to the lockdown. There, the mother due to the lack of foods, mother killed daughter, committed suicide due to the economic stress. This is a very worst condition in this lockdown. This case are detected in Maharashtra. Uh, three this in case is criminalization. We said that, and the third case in India is the land acquisition in the name of world tallest statue in Unity schedule area. This is criminalization of Adivasi in Kevadia village, Narmada district in state of Gujarat. This is the incident is the in Kevadia village, home to the Gujarat largest dam, known as Narmada Dam or Sardar Sarovar Dam. This Kevadia was a sleepy village till the construction of 182 meters world tallest statue of unity. The costing near is about 3,000 crores. It's US dollar 40 to 50, 45 millions. It's began in 2014, and it's again the land acquisition procedure start in this lockdown. The people are protesting against this uh, government action, but they are field case against the protest people. Even whole this rules and regulation is violated by the government. Illegally, they entered in the tribal villages, and they acquire this land from the tribal, and forcefully they are put it in jail to the people who are protesting to save their land in Narmada, which is the tallest statue of the world we are built in the Kevadia. This is in Gujarat. And another incidents of this about the civilization, the evacuation of the Kond Adivasis by the forest department in gross violation of FRA. It is in Odisha. There is a one villagers who are built up their home in the forest area. The forest guard has come and destroy their village. It's, they are application to government since year 2017. They want to rehabilitate their villages and homes, but the forest department are come and destroy their villages. This also violation of the indigenous peoples say hello hello
Sunil, go ahead.
yeah ah,
Yeah,
so
if you can.
yeah destructive mining of violation forest right act and human rights in culprit sanctuary near the this culprit forest area. There, this is the very worst condition there. The community with the supported groups of activities damned at the government must be immediate allowed to Nehala villagers settle the place there, want to provide with adequate compensation. That's a situation. They destroy the tribal villages in Odisha, and other case is well known is billionaire case. It's about the amidst lockdown, Mr. PM, Prime Minister of this country, Modi, launched the auction process for 41 coal blocks in commercial mining threatened to tribal people in Adivasi. This overcome economy, the crisis admitted COVID-19 as a part of central government campaigning Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan, self-reliant India. On 18 June 2020, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi launched two-stage e-auction process for 41 coal blocks for the commercial mining through the video conference, and India will be invest around 2 lakh crores in four major projects. Its conversion 100 million ton of coal into gas by the end of 2030. The government in the identified 16 aspirational districts have the huge stock of coal. Had we decided to spend 50,000 crores on the creating infrastructure for coal extraction and transport, which would create a job opportunity for the locals closer their homes. The government has set a target to gasify around hundreds millions of tons of coal by 2030. The country, which is possesses the fourth largest coal reserve, is the second largest coal produced in possible importance coal. However, was followed by protests from the several activities, trade unions, and particularly from the traditional forest developers and indigenous community, as these coal blocks are mostly located in their habitat, also falling under fifth schedule area of Madhya Pradesh. It is a state of the Indian. Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Odisha, and Maharashtra. After it is five major states of tribal community population were they affected by this auction. After nationalization of the coal sector in 1973, the public sector has been monopoly over the coal production in India. But now private company like Adani, Ambani, Tata, and Birla groups are other will be taking over this, has created panic among the indigenous habitants across the state. They state their livelihood existence in their ancestral land. The reacting to the government, move 9 elected sarpanches headed village government council wrote to Prime Minister to stop the mining auction in the area of Chhattisgarh and demanding. Yeah, so total 16 coal blocks of Chhattisgarh were auctioned in 18 June in the, near in the lockdown period or in COVID period in 18 June 2020. Since 2000, total all 20 gram Sabha, means village council, have been regularly passing resolution against the mining illegal irregularity in the land acquisition and allotment to the coal blocks without an consent of the Gram Sabha. Also, around one of the largest continuously stretches the forest in central area, spanning about 1,70,000 hectares of the land in Chhattisgarh, Sarguja, Sarajpur, and Korba. This is the predominantly tribal regions. This is the such type of violation as in this in India. Similarly, on the other hand, the tribal human rights activists critics says that the auction of 41 coal blocks without consent of the governors of this Indian law and some provisions for the tribal and protected acts are there, but they are violating and continuously these things are happening in this COVID. They are passes new rules for grab the land. Same condition in Maharashtra, Odisha, Jharkhand, which are among 41 coal blocks which this country auction commercial mining.
Dr. Sunil?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you wrap up now a bit because of the time?
Yes, sir. Last moment. Okay. I conclude that, and today I am also sitting for the fast for justice, and I have this live webinar also for one tribal innocent person as a custodial death in 2018. This is a criminal condition happening here. So today I am a seat for fasting in front of district collector office in Palghar for the one person died by the police officers. So that's type of criminalization. Even fully restricted in this COVID area, their forest guard are not allowed to cultivation in this forest area. This is condition in India. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sunil. I mean, you really covered different types of criminalization that is happening now in India with regards to the migrant Adivasi workers, violence against women, particularly from police abuse, and also the issue of land grabbing or land acquisition, and the imposition of mining again to communities. So I think we've captured what is the situation of criminalization in India. Now we move.
Maintenant, nous allons.
Rachel. So Rachel, can you briefly also describe the situation of Indigenous peoples under the lockdown, particularly also in relation to criminalization and threats to human rights for Indigenous peoples? Rachel, you can take the floor now.
Okay, so before I will talk on the COVID-19 pandemic experience here in the Cordillera, I should be more talking on the being a political prisoner. So I have to start it with this. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Indigenous people from the Ibaloi tribe in the Cordillera, Philippines, and now with the Cordillera Human Rights
Je
Alliance.
viens des peuples autochtones de la Cordillère. Nous sommes engagés au principe de défense des droits.
So thank you for inviting me to this webinar to share my own experiences with what is happening to Indigenous peoples like me. I have that passion of serving the least among our people and taking part of the people's struggle of changing significantly the miserable situation of the Indigenous peoples. It is our moral obligation, even from time immemorial, to defend and protect our land and people from government neglect. It saddens me to know that the Indigenous peoples and human rights defenders are accused of trump-up charges in the Cordillera, and other IP land rights defenders are continuing victims of state persecution. Our political conviction has become a criminal offense in the eyes of the state. The weaponization of the Philippine laws and criminalization of political dissent are part of the whole of nation approach, or WONA, being bannered by the armed forces of the Philippines as the new paradigm that would end the local armed conflict or the communist insurgency. Whole of nation approach is derived from the US counterinsurgency doctrine to sustain the attacks on the so-called legal, political structure, or the institutions and legal organizations. At the national scale, the regime's Interagency Committee Committee on Legal Action, or IACLA, intensified the state's attacks against legitimate people's organizations and legitimate political dissent, using the Philippine justice system, by using the judicial system to plan, direct, and implement the legal offensive like filing of trump-up criminal charges, arrest and detention of targeted leaders and members of the democratic movement, and even neutralize whom they deem as enemies of the state. I join the cries for justice of all the Indigenous peoples who became victims of extrajudicial killings, those charged with trump-up cases, unlawfully arrested, and other victims of state persecution all over the country as we celebrate the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. But there is nothing to celebrate if we cannot unite as Indigenous peoples in asserting our right to self-determination and genuine democracy. Because of my work, I was accused of trump-up charges of murder, 8 cases of frustrated and attempted murder by the 81st Infantry Battalion of the 7th Infantry Division of the Philippine Army in an alleged encounter between the Philippine Army and the Communist Party of the Philippines, New People's Army in Patyacan, Quirino, Ilocos Sur, Philippines, in October 15, 2017, where an AFP soldier was killed. Aside from my murder case, I have 2 other cases together with 4 women development workers of 14 counts of attempted homicide that happened allegedly also in Ilocos Sur in 2017. We were able to post bail for the two incidents, and hearings are still ongoing even in this time of COVID-19 pandemic. After 11 months of incarceration, the court, during its promulgation hearing on September 4, 2019, has found that the evidences labeled against me are insufficient and doubtful to sustain a verdict. I was acquitted in all the cases based on reasonable doubt. The judge also acknowledged that political activism is not terrorism. We celebrated with my acquittal, but sad to say that it came also with a high price, and that is the untimely death of the Honorable Judge Mario Anacleto Bañez, who acquitted me from all of my cases by the Armed Forces of the Philippines. He was killed in an ambush on his way home on November 5, 2019, 2 months after my acquittal. The situation of indigenous peoples in the Cordillera continues to mirror institutional discrimination against our people. With development aggression and militarization plaguing the region at a more aggressive pace set by the Philippine government's laws and policies, there is a need to compel the Philippine government to comply with its obligations to all human rights and international humanitarian laws, treaties, and conventions of which it is a signatory. Indigenous activists and advocates are being subjected to legal and judicial attacks by the Duterte regime, rehashing old lies, fabricating charges, and planting evidence. This government is hell-bent on arresting IP rights defenders and attempting to discredit the IP's struggle for their democratic rights. State security forces are using trump-up charges to threaten, harass, intimidate, and even neutralize whom they deem as enemies of the state and other activists working in legal organizations. Moreover, the government has taken unfair advantage of the COVID-19 pandemic to advance militarist policies and related actions that are harmful to the people and to the indigenous peoples. The COVID-19 crisis is unfairly used to intensify counterinsurgency programs by the National Task Force to End Local Communities Armed Conflict, or the NTF-LCAC. Implementation of the Enhanced Comprehensive Local Integration Program, and continued militarization of indigenous communities. Likewise, government and private business interests have seized the opportunities provided by health crisis situation to further encroach on the indigenous people's lands and territories, while operations of destructive and exploitative projects continue unabatedly amidst COVID-19 pandemic. Indigenous peoples in the Philippines is suffering disproportionately during the pandemic. The prevailing inequality in terms of access, adequacy, quality, and appropriateness of health services and facilities to indigenous peoples in their communities make them more vulnerable and less shielded against COVID-19 and measures to mitigate it. Measures to prevent or avoid the spread of virus, like wearing masks, sanitizing, and washing with water, are difficult to implement when these are not available or accessible to indigenous peoples. The situation of indigenous families in evacuation centers is even worse, since social distancing is impossible to observe due to the limited space. There is a lack or shortage of water, alcohol, food supply, and vitamins, thus increasing their vulnerability to the virus. These realities on the ground are consequences of the utter disregard of the national government to draw up a prompt and comprehensive plan to manage the health crisis and impact of the socio-economic well-being of the people. The situation of IPs worsened because there was no comprehensive plan to address the health crisis and the consequent economic crisis in the long-standing institutionalized discrimination and disregard for the rights and welfare. The cases reported as part of the state enforcement of restrictive measures created an atmosphere of increased state-sponsored oppression of indigenous communities in this time of COVID-19, further eroding IP's rights to self-determination. During this current health crisis, human rights, which includes IP's collective rights, must not be overlooked, especially when IPs are at a great economic and social disadvantage as a result of long-standing systematically discrimination by state institutions. Under the so-called new normal, more repressive measures is expected to be enforced by the state. This further threatens the IP's customary way of living and struggles to defend their land, resources, and life. The government's recommendation to continue its Build, Build, Build program as a solution to the country's economic losses caused by the pandemic means the resumption of the operation of many exploitative and destructive projects in indigenous territories such as minings, dams, and large-scale monocrop plantations, militarization of indigenous communities, implementation of the ECLIP, and further attacks under the lead of the NTF-ELCAC will continue and intensify. All of these are the threats and challenges faced by the indigenous peoples in this time of the COVID-19 crisis. So in conclusion, the indigenous peoples join the rest of the Filipino people in demanding that the Philippine government must held accountable for its negligence in providing adequate COVID-19 response. It opportunistically using the crisis to strengthen its authoritarian rule that has resulted to gross violation of the collective rights of indigenous peoples, including social, economic, and worse, attacks on their fundamental rights and freedoms, including civil and political rights. Furthermore, indigenous peoples call on the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights to continue its investigation on the Philippine human rights situation and to include the recent and worsening situation caused by the military's COVID-19 response of the Duterte regime. We also support its recommendation for the use of international accountability mechanism such as the International Criminal Court to investigate the gross human rights violations in the Philippines and put attention to the gross violations of the individual and collective rights of indigenous people. So thank you very much for this time you've given us.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I think you've made important points on how do we address this situation of COVID-19. And I just wish to highlight what you have mentioned, that it's important to demand accountability of the state to adequately respond to this pandemic instead of more human rights violations and repressive actions, because it's adding insult to injury for many indigenous peoples in the Philippines, but also abroad, where we are already suffering from discrimination and inequality, and yet being again victims of the restrictive measures that states are doing in response to the COVID. I wanted to ask you early as a follow-up question, your experience as an ex-detainee, but you've covered that already. So we now move to Joseph Itungwa. He's from, like I mentioned earlier, he's from the Democratic Republic of Congo. So from Asia, we are now moving to Africa. So Joseph will be speaking in French. But those of us who understand English should remain in the English channel and listen to the translation in English. The French speaker should be in the French channel, just so that all of us will understand what Joseph will be speaking on. So Joseph, what are the challenges and difficulties of indigenous peoples in the implementation of restrictive measures as a response to COVID-19, such as lockdowns? And what are the cases of why indigenous peoples are being put to jail for defending their lands? So based on your experience and your observation on what's happening in the RC, Joseph, kindly respond to these questions. Joseph, you can take the floor now.
Merci beaucoup. Merci,
Thank you
Joanna.
very much. Thank you, Joanna. Thank you to all the organizers and the partners for opening this process that gives us an opportunity to express ourselves, to share our experience in this context of COVID-19 and around this topic of criminalization. I am very happy about this opportunity. In the case of DRC, you may know that we have 800,000 to 1 million indigenous people in DRC. That's around
Et les contextes
20% of the total population. For most communities, we live in remote areas, in forest areas. As you know, DRC is the country that has a big part of forests and resources, and most indigenous people live in those remote areas that do not get enough investment from this. And
nos communautés
in this
autochtones
context, indigenous people have a lot of difficulties relating to access to land, securing the territory, and also relating to armed conflicts, especially around Kivu. All these issues highlight and strengthen the violations against indigenous people's human rights. There are certain cases, including Masisi in the North Kivu, also cases around protected areas. There are national parks. In the Virunga, for example, indigenous people lost their traditional lands, and this drives them to terrible poverty and a lack of dignity. There are also illegal logging in the western part of DRC, in the Maindombe province. We also have cases in the east of the country, in the Tanganyika, with conflicts between indigenous and non-indigenous communities. In the context of COVID-19, you may know that DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, is one of the 5 countries that had cases of COVID or issues around COVID in Africa. We have around 9,000 cases, and the most affected provinces, there are 4 provinces with indigenous presence: the North Province of Kivu, South, Lituri, and Choco. Most affected is the eastern part of the country. The measures imposed by the states to fight COVID-19 are part of the state emergency that was imposed in March. Those measures have had a serious impact on the life of indigenous people. Those measures that are not adapted to our way of life. When talking about lockdown, we talk about isolation, we talk about social distancing, but isolation and lockdown mean that you need means and resources to implement those measures. And our resources are precarious in our communities. They don't have enough means, not enough income. They are victims of forcible evictions of their traditional land. So how can you force people to enforce those measures when these people already live in those difficult contexts of poverty, of eviction, and human rights violations? And that's even more serious in our region. The state has imposed measures, retaliation measures. However, the justice instances are still working and still judging cases that affect indigenous people. In the North Kivu, in April, there was a judgment, a court ruling against indigenous families around their land rights. That was a court ruling that was done by default in their absence in the context of COVID-19. There was this court ruling around indigenous issues, and those people were judged without their presence. So that's another example of criminalization as part of the COVID-19 context. We believe that the pandemic has worsened the economic situation. How can there be a court ruling around land rights for indigenous people without them being present? This is one of the examples that we have documented. In the Virunga parks, indigenous people were arrested because they were trying to find means to survive, resources. These are types of examples that we have in Abu Dhabi, for example, with the national park issue. Some of our counterparts were arrested. I was arrested myself. Last year, I worked rather on trying to have an indigenous person fled from prison. This person was jailed because he was coming to a workshop in Kinshasa where we were supposed to talk about protected areas. When he came back to his village, he was arrested and was jailed in the military jail. We took the actions to free that person, but there are still many people who are imprisoned. And in the context of lockdown, humanism and this human aspect should be even more present. How can justice or court ruling can take place without these people being present when they're just trying to fight for their lands, when they are being evicted by farmers? There are many similar situations, and I believe that the judicial system of the country, the examples of human rights violations and discriminatory laws, this context of exploitations of mining resources in indigenous peoples' territories, those examples are suffering even more the consequences. We have a mining company that is called Afamin in this area where indigenous people are present. There was no specific measure to safeguard, to protect indigenous people. So there are several cases where we must fight and think how we can influence politics, how we can influence lawmakers to protect indigenous people. In this context of COVID-19, measures are being imposed as part of the state of emergency. But ignorance around the pandemic is very present in our communities. The pandemic does not discriminate. However, the measures that are imposed are discriminatory. They're not the same for all categories. And in our communities, people don't know about the pandemic. I believe it's really important to make sure that we take actions on all levels so solutions can be brought to the table. We have recommendations based on the actions that we took. We have actions taking place in Kinshasa in order to have some advocacy work to change those laws and these discriminatory laws. We have a proposal, a bill that was proposed in Parliament to make sure that indigenous people's rights are protected. This bill needs support in order to be passed into a law in Parliament. For now, this bill has been proposed, however, it has not been accepted. So we need to take actions to influence national MPs, to influence the government, so we can implement those laws, to change attitudes, to change these examples of criminalization, those attitudes that make indigenous people the issue, that make the issue being having indigenous people guilted for the issues of the country. And the judicial system also needs to change. Most of the time, indigenous people lose in court, and we really need to work on this aspect. Some people are arrested because of these protected areas, because of their fights in the territories. So those actions require support. And we see some cases where we try to provide legal assistance to those people who are wrongfully arrested simply because they're fighting for their rights. We need to strengthen capacities at local level. Our community leaders must be supported in their fight to defend their natural resources. As you may know, DRC is part of much interest and economic interest thanks to their resources, their forests, their mining explorations. So local defenders of indigenous people must take part of the discussions, the economic discussion. So we must reinforce and strengthen capacities at local level so that these fights can have a positive solution. We must also work to strengthen those monitoring actions. We need to monitor those cases. In certain areas, we must cross different regions in order to collect data. Here we have cases in this country, in my region, but there are also cases in remote areas where indigenous people are strongly affected. We must have an analysis on the impacts. We must write a report on the impact of COVID-19 on indigenous communities so we can influence national governments and international instances so they can help us in this fight to defend indigenous people's rights in the context of COVID-19. That is for my presentation, the challenges that we face and the examples of criminalizations. These are the perspectives and work objectives that we have and that we can work on.
Merci.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. Yes, thank you very much, Joseph. That gives us a glimpse on what's happening in DRC in relation to indigenous peoples. And I want to stress a couple of points that you have mentioned. One that has really got my attention is the issue of the court.
La question des tribunaux, le système judiciaire.
Justice or access to justice, as you have pointed out, that in the times of COVID, where there is lockdown, the courts are coming out, particularly those that are facing problems of land grabbing. And this to me is really what we're saying as the issue of criminalization and lack of access to justice by indigenous peoples. And then the second one that you have mentioned is that the virus does not discriminate, but the measures of the state are discriminating. And I think this is not just in the case of DRC, but also in many countries where indigenous peoples are disproportionately affected negatively by restrictions and other measures to address the COVID, including on the issue of economic recovery, as you have mentioned also, that the targeting indigenous resources have increased in the name of economic recovery under COVID. And to specific impacts of COVID Indigenous people policies uh, and respect for the rights of peoples. So, but I think if, now questions that has come up, we have 20 minutes for questions, and I want to reserve the last 10 minutes to come back to our speakers for on how what steps are we going to take, their ideas on steps that we need to do together. But let me first
tous ensemble.
to the questions. So speakers on present concept in terms of the you just and dignity of indigenous peoples throughout criminal to protect the rights and dignity. So may or are the ways Sunil? Please. Hello? Hello, can you hear me? Hello? Hello?
Mute mo na siya.
Hello?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Sorry for apologize for the technical difficulty. I would like to reread the questions that were raised by that were read by Joanne for the panelists. One of the question is addressed to all speakers. At present situation, with or without COVID-19 pandemic, what do you think are the most generalized misconception of indigenous peoples in terms of human rights? I will read all the questions so that you can answer it in one go. The second question is, what are ways that we can do to uplift the rights and dignity of indigenous peoples all throughout the world, particularly in Asia and also in Africa, who has very high rate of criminalization against indigenous peoples? What is the solution? Is it activism? Is it good enough to protect the rights and dignity of indigenous peoples? Another question for the panelists, especially from the Philippines. As an indigenous person, people's response to health and pandemic crisis, what are best practices from the community that you can share in addressing the pandemic? I would like to call on the panelists to answer these questions. You may respond to just one question or to the three questions. We can start with Sunil from India.
Shit. How did he?
Hello. Hello.
Yes, Sunil, we can hear you.
Can you repeat the question? Sorry. Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Sunil, we would like you to respond to this question. At the present situation with or without the coronavirus or the COVID-19 pandemic, what do you think are the most generalized misconception on Indigenous peoples in terms of human rights?
So here the conditions are not the definitions about the indigenous peoples are not clear in India. They are named as the tribal. That's reason we are not get international these benefits for our rights. And the another is always the marginalized all the UN trips and ILO convention are marginalized for the indigenous people of India. The day to day every day they are evacuated from their own territory for the name of development. This is a very generalized question in India for the tribal or indigenous region. Without this COVID, the indigenous people lose their territory, lands, and ancestors' territory on the name of development. Hello. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you, Sunil. Go ahead.
Yeah. So that is the basic question. Without this COVID situation and poverty, health, that's a basic issue, and uneducation. This is the issue for the tribal because of the indigenous or tribal people are living far away from the main cities. That's why the health issues are more, and even the land right issue is very in major. Hello. Hello. Hello.
We can hear you, Sunil. Please just go ahead.
Yeah.
And
So
wrap up the response. Thank you.
yeah. So in here, India, the basic questions for basic problem for the indigenous people is there is no government recognized as a tribal people as a indigenous people. This is a worldwide question for indigenous people in India. That's why the ILO conventions and the UN RIP are not applicable for the Indian tribal people. This is a basic uh, question for the and problem also for Indian tribal people in international community. And other are the original inhabitants of the India are day to day always evacuated from their own ancestral territory. That's why the tribal lose their lands and the territory. And due to these reasons, the other problem are arises just like unemployment, poverty, unhealthy conditions because of they lose their ecosystems. And on the name of development, the government grabbing tribal land for the mining, centuries, and other purpose and industrializations. That's a basic problem. And nowadays, in my area, we're facing the big millionaire billionaire project is DMIC, Delhi Mumbai Industrial Corridor. And the name is a basic bullet train project over here, freight corridor. The tribal lose their
Yes,
land,
Joseph.
they lose their lands. This is a basic problem here in India. Thank you.
Yeah, Joseph, can you wrap up your response, please? Okay. Can we hear from Rachel?
Hello. So the question from Kakai is the indigenous what's that? Health pandemic crisis to community, the best practices. So the indigenous peoples are very brave, resilient, and strong people. So no matter what calamity or health crisis may come, they will be able to overcome it through their traditional way of expressing it. So one of the I think one of the best practices they have is called the binadang. So even if there is hardship, there's no
Si
production,
c'est une situation difficile et qu'il n'y a pas de production à cause du confinement,
go fishing, go farming, but within the community, there's that they heal as one, as we say, they heal as one. So there is binadang, like in Itogon, Benguet, in the Cordillera, they have this sagaok, or sagaok means they have to share whatever gold ores they have to others who are in need of financial help, so that everyone in the community could help each other. And the other is that they have this traditional psychosocial processing within the community. So they process themselves. What are the causes of this COVID-19 pandemic? So there is psychosocial what they call that, processes within them. There are many best practices here in the Cordillera, even without the COVID-19. But they are still, it's still ongoing, especially now with health crisis. One is the lockdown. So we have this TR in the mountain province. So they will have to lock the community down so that they will not be able to, so they'll be safe from other people contaminated with such a virus. So I think those are just some of the best practices I knew of this moment. So I could email you with some of it.
Thank you, Rachel. Can we hear from Joseph? Joseph?
Merci beaucoup pour ces questions.
Thank you very much for these questions. With or without the COVID, that was the first question I heard. What are the misconceptions? And I believe the issues of violation of the rights of indigenous peoples are well known. There are those who think it's something else. We are not claiming specific rights. We are claiming our right, our fundamental rights that are recognized in the context in Africa, in the DRC, in Africa. If we look at the land rights, how can we explain that people who lived on a territory for many years and that the decisions on the territories are taken so that they are evicted from their land? They have been established on the territories of the indigenous peoples without being consulted, without consent. You are being evicted from your land. There are policies on forests, and we know that there are studies that were shown. They showed that our traditional practices made sure that these natural resources exist? And how can we explain that these decisions are made on the territories without us? We are even being evicted from these territories. This is a violation of our rights. We have the issue of discrimination at the social level during decision-making. This is well known. It's not that we're different from others, but we are claiming our rights, our values. We are different, and we need to claim our rights. How can we explain that if the constitutions of the countries say all human beings are equal, but in practice, it needs to be shown if everybody is equal, how can we ensure justice when indigenous peoples cannot win in court? This is serious. So, what do we need to do? How can we improve this? Is it activism? I think there are solutions that are suggested in all our claims. How can we change the laws, influence policies, national laws that can protect the interests of others, the rights, individual and collective rights of indigenous peoples? We cannot have laws that are old-fashioned. We need to bear in mind the traditions with regards to the land. So that's why we are victims of the laws. So we need to bear all this in mind. We need dialogue with the states also. They need to listen to us. They need to know that we are claiming our rights. We need to be listened and understood. There's also work at our level for capacity building at local level. Access to justice. All these are solutions to improve all of this. It's not by claiming the rights that the state can say, we are endangering the peace in the country, but it's the state that's creating the issues. It's not that we're claiming, because we're reclaiming our rights, means that we're having issues. We cannot proceed in this way. We need to value and promote the rights. We won't have development programs to violate the rights of people. The development of the country cannot be done whilst violating the rights of indigenous peoples. We need to influence the laws and the programs in practice. They need to take into account the traditions and the collective rights of indigenous peoples. It doesn't cost anything to the countries to do this.
Okay. Joseph.
Oui,
Hello, Joseph.
oui.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Go ahead. Okay. Are you finished,
d'accord.
Joseph?
Vous avez fini, Joseph?
Oui, parce que là, je parlais de première question. Oui, oui, c'est la troisième, il y a le
Yes,
troisième.
yes. There was the third part of the question
Okay.
regarding best practices. I think there was something left, but I think I answered the first two questions, including indigenous people's rights in the context with or without the COVID. I talked about the situation in Africa regarding the violations and the rights, and what the solutions are. Activism, yes, we need to work on activism. We also need to work on policies, and we need to work on the various cases on the ground, because things that are not done at policy level are not really done in practice. We can influence policies, people can make speeches, they can be at the UN and talking of this and that, the improvement, the various issues, They're trying to have an exchange regarding our movement, but they're saying that we're trying to threaten peace, but it's the question at local level. How can we support indigenous peoples in terms of justice? How can we support capacity building at local level for our claims? Even local authorities as well need to support indigenous peoples. Thank you very much.
Okay, comprehensive response. There's another question that coming from our audience in the Facebook, and this is to all speakers on who want to respond briefly. The question is there a separate treatment of indigenous peoples with COVID, such as isolation ward or other forms, or etc.? So, can anyone respond to this? I think it's also referring to discrimination, if you see any.
No such kind of in India. Hello.
Who? Yeah.
Yeah. No,
Is Joseph responding?
No, it's Dr. Sunil.
Okay, Sunil. Okay, can you briefly respond?
No, this is kind of treatment are not given to any indigenous as a separate ward.
Okay.
And yeah.
Okay. Others? Okay, I think that's quite a very specific, and I don't see anyone wanting to respond to that. We have the last 10 minutes. So if there are no other questions from our audience, or maybe the speakers can respond separately to some of the questions that are quite specific. I wish to also add a bit on the discussion on the misconception, and also to capture what our speakers have mentioned. I think one of the misconception of indigenous peoples is that we are regarded as barriers of development, or that we are obstacles to development, and that we are backward. And that misconception is used as a justification when we defend our lands against destructive projects, that we are against development, and so it's the country will remain poor because we are preventing this kind of projects in our territories. And that is the narrative that we need to change, because the reason why this kind of the reason of why we are against these projects is because they are not sustainable. They are actually exacerbating inequality, because the ones benefiting are not the poor, not indigenous, not farmers, not women, not persons with disabilities, but it's business. It's the economic interest of the few, and that is why we are opposing this kind of development imposition. And that is the reason why we are defending our lands and resources in that context. And that's where we are being criminalized, when we defend our lands and resources. And our practices of sustainable management are regarded as backward, and thereby not up to the modern world. So there are laws prohibiting our use of our own resources, right? So this is the kind of misconception that we really need to address and raise our voices to say that we are not barriers to development. We are actually the ones promoting and practicing sustainable development. And it's time for those corporations, for those elite, to listen to indigenous peoples and adjust their policies. As Joseph has mentioned, policies are needed. And we need policies that will thereby uphold and protect our rights so that we can sustainably use our resources. Now, I just want to go back now to our speakers for their last, their conclusions. But let me just give a specific question for some. Am I choppy again? So maybe we can start with Rachel. Rachel, given the worsening situation of given the worsening situation in the Philippines, how can we work together, and how can global solidarity provide, what kind of support at the global level is needed in responding to this kind of situation in the Philippines?
Okay, for here in the Cordillera, so indigenous peoples have launched campaigns maximizing various social media to resist the intensified incursion
sociaux pour qu'il y ait une plus grande inclusion
projects in the escalation of militarization and human rights violations led by the government. So we have this Defend Cordillera People's Alliance online petition letter writing campaign was launched in order for the national and international solidarity friends so they can sign online. So we have also this campaign, the Stop the Attacks Against Indigenous Peoples, continued at the national and level, promptly releasing urgent alerts. So I think there is also a national, international urgent letters on that, and a signature campaign will also be released internationally in support of this build project of Duterte. So we have many campaigns for this reasons. And for the international platforms, we have also raised this in Asia Preparatory Meeting on Practices of the UN held in Bali, Indonesia. So I think this is a continuing process for the indigenous peoples for the lobbying. And we also joined the lobby team to get UN members to support the Iceland resolution to investigate the Philippine government on its human rights violations. And then we have representations undertaken with the new UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, so that Katribo and Tubtuba had already submitted one. So we have many projects, we have many plans. We have this Serve the People Brigade, so we can manage to give relief to all other indigenous peoples because of food blockade caused by the lockdown. So I hope financial solidarity and other help could be given to us for this cause. Thank you.
Oh, okay, Rachel. Just to capture that the support needed is on the Defend the Cordillera campaign, and support also to the Serve the People Brigade in response to
la brigade des peuples en réponse à la COVID-19 et dans le
the implementation of the Anti-Terrorist Act. And so if you can share to us the sign-on and other materials that you have, we can share it to the participants of this webinar. So please make sure, Rachel, to share those materials so we can circulate it widely.
Yes.
Now, Joseph, as IPRI is working with your national organization, what can we do together to address this criminalization issue in DRC? Joseph.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. First thing, I insisted on that and I highlighted it. We need to support each other to influence politics and national laws. Right now, we have a legal proposal, a bill that was proposed in the parliament. So we must support all actions leading to this bill being passed in the parliament and in the Senate and in the different political instances. So we must work on communication around this. Secondly, there's this work around monitoring of cases that must be done. We must reinforce this work in the field. DRC is a very large country. There are two main parts, and we work on a national level. We have representatives at regional level, and we need support in order to carry out this work of monitoring, in order to demonstrate and to showcase the situation and change things on a political level. Thirdly, we need direct judicial and legal support. People are being arrested, people are jailed in Bukavu, for instance, on these issues around the conflicts on national parks. There has been a petition that was circulated at international level, but we also need direct legal support. How can we assist our brothers who are rotting in prison? Just imagine if you were in prison in the context of COVID-19. This is terrible. How can we support them? That's the third type of action that we need support in. Fourthly, how can we support and reinforce the capacities of local leaders where our resources are being exploited? How can we have a plan for reivindication and to block those projects in the territories, to launch campaigns against the exploitation of our resources? These are the four types of actions that we are carrying out, to sum up, and for which we need international solidarity, the support of IPRI and other partners, so we can change things.
Okay, thank you, Joseph, for reiterating the four key areas needing support, and this is on the lobby and advocacy on the bill on the rights of Indigenous peoples to be passed and adopted as a law in DRC, and also the need for continuous monitoring of human rights violations, and also providing access to justice to those that are in jail or who were criminalized. And finally, on the issue of capacity building of community leaders to be able to claim their rights and exercise their rights and dignity. So now, Sunil,
Yes.
what are the ways forward in terms of dealing with the situation in India?
Hello.
What are your recommendations? Yeah, we're a bit running off. Yeah, okay.
Hello.
Sunil, go ahead. Yeah. Sunil?
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah. In India, about this situation, we are a recommendation that make a COVID drugs vaccination affordable to the universally, give the top priority to the prevents early diagnosis and treatment for the migrant returns, ensure the government provisions of relief and other assistance to the poor and the needy Adivasi people, and employ a gender sensitized approach to the COVID-19 management and recovery. This provides access to appropriate technologies to ensure effective communication in indigenous languages, online education, and facilities for the Adivasi in children in rural areas. Strengthen capacity at the community and the territory level through the awareness raising and the Adivasi community to ensure their collective survival and well-being. Acknowledge, respect, and protect the culture, spiritual rights, and practices of indigenous people when considering measures to the control spread of this virus. Respect to IPS traditional customary institution and practices. Provide culturally appropriate healthcare services, food, humanitarian relief, and marginalized groups without discrimination. Create livelihood opportunities and promote indigenous women and youth entrepreneurship in rural setting according to needs and opportunities. They recognize and protect the right of Adivasi in their customary forest, lands, and and the resources and support their effort in initiatives to combat the pandemic, including in relation to food, production, development of herbal medicine, sustainable use of resources for their livelihood, among others. That's kind of recommendation from my side, and thank you for this opportunity.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Joseph, also for highlighting concrete recommendations on how to address this pandemic, because it's really, I mean, indigenous peoples really need access to proper health services. But as you also pointed out, is the need to ensure the protection, the protection of the rights of indigenous peoples, and for indigenous peoples to have proper and sustainable livelihood sources to still be able to cope with the economic impact of this pandemic. Thank you to all our speakers. But before I say also thank you to everyone, I just want to acknowledge the presence of Seth Jimenez. She is the Special Rapporteur on Arbitrary Internal Displacements. And for sure, Seth, we will share to you the information we have on internally or arbitrary displacements of indigenous peoples. This has been clearly monitored in the different countries. We have cases in DRC, India, of course, also in the Philippines, and this is related on land grabbing issues, including in conservation areas. So, Seth will get in touch. We'll get in touch with you on this for sure. And thanks for joining us. Vicky was also among the participants in this webinar. But finally, again, to thank you all our speakers for sharing your time, sharing your experience, and also we take into account all your recommendations on how we can work together in addressing the criminalization of indigenous peoples, and more importantly, on how we can build and strengthen global solidarity and acting together in this situation where our rights, our welfare, and our dignity and well-being as indigenous peoples is seriously under threat. So it's in our cooperation and unity that we can overcome. So, and I also want to thank the IPRI staff who are behind the scene, making sure that this webinar is working. We apologize for any technical glitches along the way, but I hope all of us, including me, have learned a lot from this conversation, and we will carry on having this kind of event. And I want to announce that we will have another one tomorrow, which will be our colleagues, partners in Central, in Latin America, who are also one of the worst hit by COVID and complicated further by the restrictions also imposed on them. So thank you again. We will be asking for feedback later from our listeners. And we will, if there are specific questions, we will get back to you. We will send that to the specific speakers so that they can still respond to your questions. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to all our listeners, those who have joined this, this discussion. And thank you to my colleagues at IPRI. And let's continue this kind of exchange. And even if the International Indigenous Peoples Day is over, I still wish all my colleagues and express my warmest solidarity to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you to the interpreters for a very great job.